On a summer morning in 1821, a small newspaper in western New York printed a story that should have stopped its readers cold. Diggers near a riverbank, the paper claimed, had unearthed a human skeleton stretching 9 feet from skull to heel. The bones, it reported, crumbled when touched, but not before witnesses measured a jaw large enough to fit over a living man's face. There were no photographs. There was no scientist. There was only the printed word, set in type and sold for a few cents on the street corner. And that word was enough. In the early decades of the 1800s, American newspapers were multiplying faster than any institution could regulate them. Towns of a few hundred people supported their own weekly papers, and every editor competed for readers with sensation. A giant skeleton was perfect currency. It cost nothing to print, it demanded no proof, and it thrilled a public hungry for wonder in a young and unmapped country. Editors rarely questioned these accounts. They copied them from neighboring papers, added a detail, inflated a measurement, and passed them down the line like folklore wearing the mask of fact. Readers in Boston, Cincinnati, and Savannah encountered nearly identical stories within weeks of one another, each presented as local truth. The skeletons were always enormous. They were always found by ordinary men doing ordinary work, digging a well, clearing a field, blasting rock for a road. And they always vanished. The bones dissolved in air, or were reburied, or shipped to some unnamed college that no one could later locate. This pattern, repeated across hundreds of columns, built something larger than any single tale. It planted a national idea that beneath American soil lay the remains of a lost race of giants, a people who had walked this continent before memory. The stories fed one another, growing bolder each decade, but these headlines did not emerge from nothing. They pointed toward real places, real mounds of earth rising from the American landscape, structures that genuinely predated the settlers who marveled at them. To understand why the giants seemed so believable, we must first stand before the mounds themselves. Across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, the land is not flat. It rises in deliberate shapes, cones, ridges, and vast geometric enclosures of packed earth. Some span 10 feet high. Others, like Monk's Mound at Cahokia in Illinois, climb nearly 100 feet and cover 14 acres at the base, larger in footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. These are the American earthworks, and they are entirely real. Built between roughly 1000 BC and 1400 AD by indigenous cultures, the mounds served as burial sites, ceremonial platforms, and the foundations of cities. At their peak, Cahokia may have held 20,000 people, rivaling contemporary European towns. The people who raised them moved millions of cubic feet of soil using baskets and human labor, an achievement demanding organization, engineering, and generations of effort. When 19th-century settlers encountered these structures, they refused to believe the truth. They could not accept that the ancestors of Native Americans, whom they were actively displacing, had built such monuments. So they invented a substitute. A vanished race, they said. A superior and mysterious people who had raised the mounds and then disappeared, perhaps destroyed by the very tribes the settlers now fought. This myth of the mound builders became a national comfort. It erased indigenous achievement and justified conquest in a single stroke. And it needed evidence. When farmers plowed into burial mounds and struck human bone, they were primed to see something extraordinary. A skeleton laid in a flexed position, its knees drawn up, could appear jumbled and elongated to an untrained eye. A skull separated from its spine, resting near the leg bones, invited wild reconstruction. Add a measuring tape held by an excited hand, and an ordinary burial became a giant. The newspapers were waiting. Every mound opened, every bone lifted from the earth, fed the appetite that print had created. The mounds gave the giant stories a physical home, a place to point to, a reason to believe. But the reports did not stay vague. They began attaching names, towns, and precise numbers, transforming rumor into something that looked disturbingly like documented fact. The most persuasive giant stories carried the weight of specifics. They named the county. They named the farmer. They gave the depth of the pit and the length of the femur in inches. In 1845, a paper described a skeleton pulled from a mound near Chillicothe, Ohio, its thigh bone alone said to measure 4 feet. In the 1870s, reports from Cartersville, Georgia, told of skeletons 7 and 8 feet tall, ranged in rows as if a whole army of giants had been buried together. In 1885, the Nevada Humboldt region produced a claim of a body reaching over 10 feet. The details made the stories real. A reader could picture the exact hillside, the exact witness, the exact rusted tape stretched across yellowed bone. Newspapers understood this instinctively. The more concrete the account, the harder it was to dismiss, and the further it traveled. Editors reprinted one another's stories across state lines, and with each retelling, the numbers grew. A skeleton reported at 7 feet in one paper became 8 in the next, then 9, then a monster of impossible scale. The measurements swelled because no one was measuring. That was the crucial flaw. Nearly every account included the same convenient detail. The bones crumbled upon exposure to air, or were lost in transit, or handed to a traveling doctor who was never seen again. The evidence always vanished at the precise moment it might have been examined. A skull that could have been weighed, compared, and catalogued, instead dissolved into dust the instant a scientist might have asked to see it. This was not always deliberate fraud. Old bone genuinely is fragile, and poorly excavated remains do fall apart. But the pattern was too perfect, repeated in hundreds of stories across decades, to be innocent. The giants existed only in the narrow window between discovery and disappearance, alive just long enough to fill a column of print. And then, in 1869, a group of men decided not to wait for the earth to produce a giant. On a farm in upstate New York, they buried one themselves, and the whole nation came running. In October 1869, workers digging a well behind the farm of William Newell in Cardiff, New York, struck stone 3 feet down. As they cleared the soil, a shape emerged, a human figure over 10 feet long, carved in gray stone, lying as if it had died in agony and turned to rock. Word spread within hours. By the next day, crowds were streaming toward the farm. Newell put up a tent and charged 50 cents to view the Cardiff Giant. Soon he raised the price to $1, and still they came, hundreds each day, farmers and ministers and professors, arriving by wagon and rail. Some declared it a petrified man, proof of the giants named in the book of Genesis. Others called it an ancient statue. The debate only swelled the crowds and the prophets. But the giant was a lie, and its maker was a man named George Hull. A tobacco farmer, an avowed skeptic, Hull had grown irritated after arguing with a preacher about biblical giants. To mock believers and to make money, he devised a hoax. In 1868, he bought a block of gypsum in Iowa, shipped it secretly to Chicago, and hired stonecutters to carve a colossal human figure. They aged it with acid and stabbed it with needles to mimic pores. Then Hull buried it on his cousin Newell's land and waited a full year before arranging its discovery. The scheme worked beyond his hopes. He and his partners sold a majority stake in the giant for tens of thousands of dollars. Scientists who examined it, including scholars from Yale, quickly pronounced it a fraud, noting fresh tool marks and unweathered stone. But their verdict barely slowed the crowds. People wanted the giant to be real, and paid to believe it. The Cardiff Giant revealed the true engine behind the entire phenomenon. It was not evidence that drove the giant craze. It was desire, the public's hunger for wonder, and the willingness to pay for it. That hunger did not go unnoticed. One showman in particular saw in the giant not a curiosity, but a market. Phineas Taylor Barnum had built a fortune on the American appetite for spectacle. By 1869, his name was synonymous with exhibition, with the strange and the sensational displayed for a price. When he heard of the Cardiff Giant drawing paying crowds in New York, he moved quickly. Barnum offered to buy or lease the figure. The owners refused. So Barnum did what defined his career. He made his own. He commissioned a plaster copy of the Cardiff Giant, installed it in a New York exhibition hall, and advertised it as the genuine article. His fake of a fake soon drew larger crowds than the original. When the Giant's owners protested, threatening to sue, the story only spread further, filling newspapers and selling more tickets on every side. It was during this episode that a phrase entered American legend, often attributed to Barnum, that there was a sucker born every minute. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, they captured the logic of the entire Giant economy. Wonder was a commodity. Belief could be sold at the door for 50 cents or $1, and the customer left satisfied whether the object was real or not. This was the machinery that had been driving the Giant stories all along. Newspapers sold copies. Showmen sold tickets. Farmers charged admission to their fields. Local reputations were built on being the town where the Giant was found. At every stage, someone profited from the public's desire to believe, and that profit motive kept the stories flowing regardless of truth. Barnum understood something the scientists did not. The facts were almost irrelevant. What mattered was the experience of astonishment, the thrill of standing before something impossibly large, the story a visitor could carry home. A giant did not need to be authentic to be valuable. It only needed an audience willing to pay. And so the Giants multiplied, propped up by commerce as much as by print. But not everyone was buying. In universities and government bureaus, a different kind of mind was beginning to examine the mounds and the bones, armed not with a ticket booth, but with a shovel, a ledger, and a demand for proof. While newspapers sold wonder by the column inch, a quieter revolution was taking shape in Washington. In 1879, Congress established the Bureau of Ethnology under the Smithsonian Institution, and a botanist turned archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas was handed a mission that would collide directly with the Giant craze. His task: settle, once and for all, the question of who built the thousands of earthen mounds scattered across the eastern United States. Between 1882 and 1890, Thomas and his field agents excavated more than 2,000 mounds across 21 states, cataloging skeletons, pottery, copper ornaments, and burial layers, with a discipline the press never bothered to imitate. Where a reporter measured a femur by rumor, Thomas measured it with calipers. His 1894 report, running over 700 pages, delivered a blunt verdict. The mounds were not the work of vanished giants or a lost white race. They were built by the ancestors of Native Americans, ordinary people of ordinary height, burying their dead as human communities had always done. No 9-foot skeletons. No jaws that fit over a living man's face. Just careful stratigraphy and thousands of catalog numbers. But science moved at the speed of monographs, and the press moved at the speed of ink. A single sensational headline reached more readers in one morning than Thomas's report reached in a decade. A newspaper could print Giant unearthed in 48-point type. Thomas could only offer footnotes. When a paper in Ohio or Nevada announced a 12-foot skeleton in 1895, no editor phoned the Bureau of Ethnology for comment. The correction, if it came, ran on page 9, weeks later, buried like the bones it discussed. Scientists dismantled the myth methodically, brick by evidentiary brick, but the myth kept rebuilding itself overnight, faster than any scholar could tear it down. Thomas won the argument and lost the audience. The Giants survived, not because the evidence supported them, but because the evidence was boring and the lie was thrilling. And beneath the shouting match between laboratory and printing press lay a simpler, more embarrassing truth about many of these discoveries. Some giants were never hoaxes at all. They were honest mistakes, made by men who had never seen the bones of a mammoth. Not every giant was a lie. Many were errors, made by farmers and country doctors who dug up something enormous and reached for the only explanation their imaginations could supply. Consider the mastodon. An adult mammoth americanum stood over 9 feet at the shoulder, its thigh bone longer and thicker than any human femur ever grown. When a plowman in Missouri or a well digger in Indiana struck a massive limb bone in 1840, he was not looking at anatomy charts. He saw a leg the size of a fence post and concluded, reasonably enough to him, that a giant man had once walked here. The mammoth offered the same trap. Its curved tusks, cracked and weathered, could pass for ribs. Its molars, the size of a fist, were mistaken for grinding human teeth. Whale bones deceived coastal communities. A whale vertebra, disc-shaped and broad, resembles nothing so much as a monstrous human joint, and beached remains hauled inland lost all context. Cave bear skulls, cattle pelvises, even the fused backbones of large fish were all pressed into the giant story. The confusion was genuine because comparative anatomy was rare knowledge in rural America. Few towns had a naturalist, fewer still had a reference collection. A local paper printed what the finder believed, and the finder believed what the bones suggested. Thomas Jefferson himself had puzzled over mastodon remains at the turn of the century, wondering whether the great creature still roamed the western frontier. If the president could be mystified by such bones, a farmhand in 1855 could hardly be blamed for guessing wrong. The tragedy was that measurement made everything worse. A mastodon femur measured accurately at 4 feet became, in retelling, the leg bone of a man 12 feet tall. Honest error and eager exaggeration braided together until no one could untangle them. And yet, when scientists eventually collected these bones, cataloged them, and stored them away in institutional drawers, a new suspicion took root. If the giants were merely animals, why had so many bones disappeared into the Smithsonian's vaults, never to be seen again by the public who first dug them out? The story refused to die. It simply changed shape. By the late 20th century, and especially with the arrival of the internet, a new claim spread across message boards and cable television. The Smithsonian Institution had discovered thousands of genuine giant skeletons and deliberately hidden or destroyed them to protect mainstream science. Websites cited a supposed 1900s cover-up, a fictional Supreme Court ruling, and phantom shipments of bones dumped into the Atlantic. None of it held up. The alleged court case does not exist in any legal record. The specific document numbers cited trace back to fabricated screenshots, not archives. The Smithsonian, far from suppressing the mound skeletons, had published them in exhaustive detail through Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report, the very work that debunked the giant race in the first place. The truth about the surviving evidence is more mundane and more revealing. When 19th-century collectors excavated mounds, the human remains they recovered were ordinary in size. Many entered institutional collections, where they were measured, labeled, and stored, exactly the paper trail a cover-up would never leave. The reason no giant skeleton sits in a museum drawer is simple. None was ever collected, because none was ever real. The bones that vanished did so not into a vault, but into the gap between a sensational headline and a follow-up that never came. A giant reported in an 1885 paper was described once, then forgotten. No specimen was retained because the discovery was rumor, misidentification, or invention. The conspiracy theory inverts the evidence entirely. It treats absence as proof of concealment, when absence is simply proof of non-existence. The Smithsonian became the villain precisely because it was the authority that said no, and myths need a villain to explain why reality disagrees with them. The institution that dismantled the giant story was recast as the institution that stole it, which leaves the final question, the one that outlived every hoaxer, every showman, and every honest farmer with a mastodon bone. If the evidence was always missing, and the science was always clear, why did Americans keep believing in giants for 2 full centuries? The giants endured because they were never really about bones. They were about a young nation trying to explain a land it did not understand. When settlers pushed west and found the great mounds of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, they faced monuments built by peoples they were actively displacing. A race of ancient giants was a comfortable fiction, a way to imagine that some grand, vanished civilization, not the ancestors of the Native Americans being pushed off that very ground, had raised those earthworks. The giant myth eased a national conscience, while feeding a national imagination. Newsprint did the rest. The 19th century was the age of the penny paper, when circulation meant survival, and a startling headline meant sales. A 12-foot skeleton in a county gazette could be reprinted across the country within weeks, each retelling adding an inch here, a detail there, until the story hardened into something readers assumed must be true because they had seen it so many times. There was no mechanism for correction, no incentive to retract. The wonder sold. The debunking did not. The Cardiff Giant drew crowds even after it was exposed. Barnum understood the arithmetic of belief better than any scientist, and so the giants survived every disproof. Cyrus Thomas measured them away. Comparative anatomy explained them as mastodons and whales. The Smithsonian cataloged the ordinary bones that were actually there. Yet the stories kept circulating, decade after decade, because a good story needs no evidence, only repetition. The modern conspiracy theories are simply the latest reprint, the 19th century headline, forwarded into the 21st century, still hungry for readers who want the marvelous to be real. What remains is not a lost race, but a lasting lesson about how belief is manufactured, how a claim printed often enough becomes a memory, and how a memory becomes a fact no correction can reach. Search every cave, every mound, every construction site the paper's named, and you will find no bones of the vanished giants. There is only the paper itself, yellowed and insistent. The giants lived in newsprint, not in earth.